Dead America. Tales from the Front Lines. The Prisoner Detail by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 17. Post Falls, Idaho. 25 miles east of Spokane. The morning light poked through the sides of the blinds, landing directly on Brad's face and stirring him from his slumber. Rather than pull the covers over his face and squeeze a few more minutes of sleep out of the morning, he sat up. Brad winced as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, letting his feet dangle just above the carpet. The last few weeks had been exhausting, and his early 30s body felt every bump, bruise, and burn that had come his way. He looked down at his right arm, lifting up the crimson-stained white bandage that was affixed to his forearm. Underneath, the burn he had suffered nearly 2 weeks ago was healing nicely, although it still had a ways to go. If I could get some extended rest, this thing might actually heal, Brad muttered to himself. Brad shook his head in defeat, knowing that time off wasn't something that was in the cards for him. He did his best to stretch out his sore muscles as he walked across the small bedroom to a pile of blood-stained orange clothes that were piled up on the dresser. As he put them on, he looked over at the pictures on the wall. There were nearly a dozen framed photos depicting a happy family adorning the walls of the bedroom. The mother, father, and their 2 young children were dressed up in their Sunday best, posing in a field as the sun was setting behind them. Brad stared at them for a moment, completely unmoved by the imagery. I never did understand the simple life. Punching a time clock every day, kids running wild, PTA meetings. A shiver ran down Brad's spine as he pictured himself having to do that. Even with all the horror he had seen in his life, little was more terrifying than that. Before he could frighten himself further, a booming voice yelled out from the front room of the house. "All right, maggots, get your lazy asses up. There's a long day of work waiting for you." Brad let out a sigh as he finished getting dressed and walked out of the bedroom. As he made his way down the hallway, he passed an open door, pausing ever so briefly to glance in that direction. On the left side of the room, there was a bunk bed, each one adorned with superhero sheets. On the walls hung posters of professional athletes for the Seattle football team, and tucked away in the corner was a small television set with a video game console hooked up to it. On the right, however, was a horrific scene. The dresser and mirror lay in pieces, blood splattered on the walls, and a dried pool of it had soaked into the carpet. Several bloody footprints tracked out of the room and down the hallway. Brad stared at them as he followed them with his eyes, eventually stopping at the beginning of the living room, where another pool of dried blood had soaked into the carpet. "There you are, sunshine. Get your ass out here," the voice boomed again. Brad snapped back into the moment as he looked up and spotted the boss, a no-nonsense Marine with a shaved head, surly attitude, and enough muscles to bench press a small car. "I'm coming, boss, I'm coming," Brad said. Brad shambled down the hallway, stopping in front of the boss, who stared at him incredulously. "You know the drill, prisoner. Let's get those hands up," the boss ordered. Brad let out a yawn as he complied, turning around and raising his hands high into the air. While they were up, the boss patted down the orange jumpsuit wearing prisoner. Once he was satisfied that there was no hidden weapon, the boss motioned for Brad to put his hands down. "Does this place have anything to eat?" the boss asked. "There are some pre-packaged danishes in the cupboard, boss. But don't worry, I didn't take any of them. I know the rules," Brad replied. The boss gave Brad a look up and down before nodding and pointing towards the kitchen. "Well, why don't you run into the kitchen and fetch us both one?" the boss said. Brad stood there, confused, for just a moment before reality hit him. With a groan, he shuffled into the kitchen. "You're sticking me with another newbie today, aren't you, boss?" Brad asked. "Why else would I be letting you steal some contraband, Brad?" the boss replied. "So how did I end up being your favorite?" "Because I know damn well it's not my sunny disposition," Brad said. "It's simple, Brad. You keep people alive. At least longer than most. I let Jimmy train a newbie yesterday, and it was lights out before they cleared their first house," the boss explained. In Jimmy's defense, he's not really a people person. It's entirely possible he fed the poor bastard to them, Brad said. Brad walked back into the living room carrying the pre-packaged danishes. The boss let out a laugh at the thought of Jimmy rebelling against human contact. I know you're not the biggest people person either, Brad. But I tell you what, if you get this guy to lunch, I'll get you something off the grill, the boss offered. I can work with that, boss, Brad replied. Well, come on then, we're burning daylight, the boss said. The two men walked out of the house, finding themselves in a quaint tree-lined neighborhood. In normal times, at this time of the morning, several cars would be driving down the road, ready to sit in traffic for their morning commute. On this morning, however, a couple of dozen prisoners in orange jumpsuits were lined up in the middle of the street, awaiting their orders for the morning. Pacing around them were half a dozen armed soldiers, there to make sure the prisoners did as they were told. So where's this prick at? Brad asked. Be nice, Brad. You don't want to get off on the wrong foot now, the boss cautioned. No offense, boss, but if he found his way into the prison detail, it's pretty safe to assume he's a prick, Brad said. The boss thought about it for a moment before cracking a smile and nodding in agreement. Fair enough, Brad. Where do you want us to start this morning? Brad asked. Why don't you get him situated, then hit that two-story house down on the corner? I'm going to get the rest of these boys clearing the other side of the street. So we'll be close by if you get in over your head, the boss instructed. You got it, boss, Brad replied. The boss nodded and walked off towards the group of prisoners lined up in the middle of the road, yelling as he went. Meanwhile, Brad sauntered over to the new recruit that was sitting on the curb. As Brad approached, he could see that the man was petrified, staring off into the middle distance with an expression that looked like he was regretting every decision he had ever made in his life. All right, on your feet, Brad ordered. Gary broke out of his daze, snapping his attention to Brad, who was walking up towards him. Confusion was etched on his 28-year-old face as he pulled himself up to his feet, meeting Brad eye to eye. Are you my teacher? Gary asked. Brad spoke in an authoritative tone to the younger man, catching Gary off guard. Let's get one thing straight right now, buddy. I'm not your teacher, I'm not your friend, and I'm certainly not your mommy. I'm here to do one thing, and that's to show you how to stay alive on this detail. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Very clear, Gary replied. And knock that sir shit off. My name's Brad, so that's what you're going to call me, Brad said. Okay, Brad, I'm Gary and Gary started to say. Brad spoke up forcefully, cutting Gary off. Let me stop you right there, Gary. Half the guys on this detail don't make it to day 3, and damn near 20% of them don't see their first lunch break. So I tell you what, if you live to lunchtime, you can tell me about yourself. Until then, I'm going to need you to shut up and listen to me. Are we clear on that? Crystal clear, Gary said. Good, come on, because there's work to be done, Brad said. Brad led Gary across the street, nodding at a couple of the guards as they walked by. In the middle of the yard sat a couple of large rolling garbage cans with their lids open. Inside were a wide assortment of weaponry. Level with me, Gary, how strong are you? Brad asked. I'm not like the bossman over there, but I can hold my own, Gary replied. Brad nodded as he dug around in the trash can, eventually pulling out a 7-foot-long, thick piece of rebar that had been filed to a point on one end. As he tossed it over to Gary, he watched as the newcomer looked at the makeshift weapon with confusion. Is this a joke? Gary asked. If it is, it's not a very funny one, Brad replied. What in the hell am I supposed to do with this? Gary asked. You're the setup man, Brad said. What does that mean? Gary asked. Patience, Gary, patience, Brad replied. Brad dug around in the trash can for another few moments before pulling out a shorter, blood-stained piece of rebar. He looked around the ground for something but wasn't satisfied with what he saw, prompting him to yell out to one of the guards. Hey, where in the hell are the tools? Brad called out. They're a couple blocks down at the community center. Big clear job up there this morning, the guard replied. And nobody could be bothered to find us some more tools? It's not like hammers and screwdrivers are particularly rare, Brad said. The guard shrugged at Brad, enraging the prisoner. Much to his own amazement, he managed to keep his rage bottled up. "Well, I'm putting you on notice now. When I find a hammer in that first house, I'm keeping it for the day," Brad said. "Do what you gotta do, prisoner. Just make sure you don't keep it on you during pat-down," the guard replied. "Don't worry, when you feel something hard, you'll know it's 100% me," Brad said. The guard flipped off Brad, eliciting a chuckle from the prisoner. "Come on, Gary, we got work to do." The two prisoners began walking towards the house on the corner, the large two-story structure looming in the distance. "So what are we supposed to do, Brad?" Gary asked. "Well, Gary, I'm going to bark out orders to you and you're going to follow them," Brad replied. "Okay, but I mean, in terms of specifics." Gary trailed off as an agitated Brad spoke up forcefully. "Gary, I need you to shut the hell up so I can get focused. Now don't worry, I'm going to tell you what to do just before it's time to do it. I'm not going to surprise you with anything. In fact, it's in my best interest to keep you alive, at least through lunch, because if I do, I get a fresh hot meal instead of the cold abomination they call food. Do you understand?" Gary looked around sheepishly after being dressed down by Brad, but finally nodded. "Okay, Brad, I'll do what you tell me to do when it's time to do it." "Fantastic, we're moving in the right direction finally. Now, are you a man of your word, Gary?" Brad asked. "I'd like to think I am," Gary replied. "Good, you better be. Because if you don't follow my orders, the last thing you're ever going to see on this earth is the tip of my weapon going straight into your brain. Because I'm too tired to be dealing with runners, so I'm not going to wait for you to turn. Do you understand me?" Brad said. Gary's eyes got large at the bluntness coming from Brad, nodding ever so slightly. "Good. Now it's time for your first lesson. Clearing a two-story house." Chapter 2. Brad and Gary walked up towards the two-story house on the corner, stepping onto the footpath leading from the street to the front door. Both men stared up at the large structure, impressed with its size. "This must have set the owners back a pretty penny," Brad said. "There's what, 2,500 square feet in this bad boy?" Gary stood there, confused, unsure of how to answer. "I guess?" Brad continued. Either these people had a huge family, in which case one of the parents had to be running drugs for the cartel to afford this place, or it's some lucky old bastard who bought this place 60 years ago for some loose change he found underneath his car seat. Gary couldn't contain it anymore, blurting out, "My God, man, what am I supposed to do? I don't care about who lived here." Brad turned to the newcomer, seeing the panic and terror in his eyes. He put his hand on Gary's shoulder, speaking in hushed tones. "Rule number 1, Gary, distract yourself from the horrors of this world. I ramble on about shit that doesn't matter because it helps me clear my mind before going into a battle. Do you understand?" "I mean, kind of," Gary replied. "Gary, we're about to break down the door to someone's home, and if they're still shambling about inside, we're going to be sticking these pointy sticks through their faces. Now, do you want to think about how horrible that is? Or do you want jokes running through your head?" Gary contemplated for a moment before finally responding, "You know, it might not be running drugs. Maybe the mom sells sexy pictures online." Brad cracked a smile as he smacked Gary on the shoulder. "Sexy soccer mom. I can get behind that." "I'm pretty sure those pictures cost extra," Gary quipped. Brad let out a laugh as he motioned for Gary to follow him up towards the front of the house, stopping at the large front window, seeing that the curtains were pulled shut. "Well, that's not a good sign." "What makes you say that?" Gary asked. "In my experience so far, whenever the curtains have been pulled shut around the house, it usually means someone is inside." "That makes sense. If you're fleeing, you don't really care about the curtains. But if you're hunkering down from stuff outside." "Yep, now you're getting it." "Okay, let's circle around to the back." Brad led the two of them around the house, looking up at each window as they walked by, seeing that the curtains were pulled tightly shut on each of them. He poked his head around the corner of the house, spotting a couple of the guards sitting on some patio furniture a couple houses up. They immediately took notice of the prisoners as they walked out into the open. Brad gave them a friendly wave as he muttered under his breath, "What a bunch of lazy assholes." Not a fan of theirs, I take it? Gary asked. We're all in this together, but we're the ones who are taking all the risk. So, yeah, not a fan of theirs. Brad walked up to the back sliding glass door, looking in through it as best he could. The blinds on it had been pulled shut, making it difficult. However, despite the limited view, Brad could see some movement coming from the front room. Okay, it looks like we have some trouble inside. How much? Gary asked. At least one, that's all I can see. So what do we do? Well, Gary, I'm going to break down this door. Then you're going to take the lead. Gary's eyes got wide with fear. Why am I taking the lead? Because you said you were strong, Gary. You have the long poker, so when you spot one of those things, your job is to jam it into its chest and hold it in place. Hold it in place? For what? Brad cracked a smile as he thrust his shorter spear towards the glass on the back door. He hit it with enough force that it began to spiderweb, the protective coating on it preventing it from shattering fully. Once it's in place, I'm going to put it down. Brad pulled the makeshift weapon back and repeatedly slammed it into the same spot, just by the lock, punching through to the other side. He then darted forward, quickly reaching his hand inside and flicking the lock to open. Here we go, Gary, trial by fire. Brad grabbed the sliding glass door, flinging it open with a flourish before taking a few steps back. All right, Gary, let's see what you can do. Brad grabbed Gary by the shoulder, shoving him in through the door and into the darkened house. As Gary stood there, clutching his weapon in an offensive position, Brad startled him as he grabbed the blinds and flung them open, allowing the light to bathe the kitchen. Gary didn't have to wait long to try out his new weapon, as a creature from the living room moaned and shambled into the doorway. The former adult man was covered in multiple bite marks, the blood long since dried on his clothing. Aim for the chest and give it all you got, Brad instructed. Gary nodded and got his spear in the proper position, waiting for the creature to come within striking distance. Gary let out a scream as he stepped forward, thrusting the makeshift spear with everything he had. The tip of the rebar cracked through the zombie's chest, nearly piercing through the entirety of the torso. The ghoul thrashed about, angry about not being able to move towards the fresh meal mere feet away. Rather than strike, Brad looked intently at Gary, trying to get a sense of how he was handling himself. It took several tense moments of struggling with the creature before Gary yelled out, "What in the hell are you waiting on? Put this thing down." Brad immediately snapped into action, stepping over to the side of Gary and delivering a forceful strike with his weapon. The tip hit the ghoul right in the side of the head, cracking the skull and immediately dropping the creature towards the ground. Gary held a firm grip on the spear, which was keeping the ghoul upright. He just stared at the creature, not sure of what to make of what just happened. "You can pull the spear out now," Brad said. Gary snapped back to the moment, yanking back on the weapon to free it from the zombie's torso. He took a step towards Brad, fire in his eyes. "You want to tell me what in the hell that was?" "What are you referring to, Gary?" Brad asked. "I'm referring to the fact you just stood there while I had this thing on the hook for you. And you just learned the next rule. Whoever has point has control of the situation. The striker only strikes when instructed, because the point man has the full vision of what is happening in front of them." Gary stood there, staring at Brad but soaking up the information he was being provided. It took him a moment of contemplation before nodding in agreement. "Okay, that makes sense. In the future, though, when you call out a strike, make sure you tell the striker where to go, if you're holding them still, or if you're pushing them off to one side or the other. Communication is key." "Got it," Gary said. Before Brad could continue, the duo turned when they heard moaning coming from the front room, putting them both on edge. Brad smacked Gary on the shoulder, motioning for him to take point again, which he did. As they stepped into the living room, Gary stopped and began dry heaving at the sight. "Welcome to the worst job in the world, Gary." Brad patted Gary on the back as he continued dry heaving at the young girl on the couch. She couldn't have been more than 15, and it was clear that her last moments on this earth were anything but pleasant. Her legs were lying on the ground at the base of the couch, while her torso was lying on its side on the blood-stained cushions. She thrashed about with her arms, excited to see fresh meat standing in front of her. However, they had been crudely cut off at the elbows some time ago. Despite her vigorous attempts, she couldn't quite get any traction. Okay, Gary, time to learn your next rule. Headshots. This isn't my first day in the apocalypse, Brad. I know how to deliver a headshot. Well, by all means, saddle up, cowboy, and show me what you can do. Gary got his weapon ready, gripping it tightly as he stared down at the thrashing creature. It took him a few moments to summon the courage to strike, but his thrust forward was on target. The tip of the sharpened rebar pierced right through the ghoul's eye, putting her to rest. Nicely done, Gary. Before Brad could continue, they heard footsteps coming from above. Both of them looked up, following the sounds as they moved across the floor. It looks like whoever is upstairs is out and about. Come on, let me show you a rule that only applies to multi-level buildings. Gary nodded and followed Brad over to the base of the steps. As they listened to the footfalls coming from above them, both kept an eye on the back half of the house. Aren't you worried about what's back there? Gary asked. Both the doors are shut. If there is something back there, it can wait. Gary thought about it for a moment before nodding and going back to listening to Brad's wisdom. Hey, would you hurry up? We don't have all day down here. Brad's yelling excited the creature on the second floor, its footsteps picking up the pace as it came around the banister on the stairwell. Gary got ready to strike, but Brad put his hand up, getting the newcomer to calm down. We'll need that in a second, so don't go too far with it, Brad said. Brad motioned for Gary to take a couple of steps back as the zombie got to the first step. Both of them watched as the creature began its descent down the stairs, which was a lot faster than it had hoped for. The ghoul bounced off several steps, thrashing about as it fell. It took a few seconds before it smacked down right at the two prisoners' feet. Without being prompted to do so, Gary jammed the tip of the rebar into the back of the ghoul's head, ending the threat. Now, for the record, this really only works when there are one or two of those things. If you get a pack of them up top, you inevitably have one or two that end up crowd surfing their way to you. And the only thing I hate more than a runner is a shambler being rocketed at me after sliding down the stairs on the backs of his friends. I can safely say that I could live to a ripe old age and be satisfied with never seeing that for myself, Gary said. Well, if you see more than two of those things at the top of the stairs, get to the next room, because they get too unpredictable when they're falling in those numbers. Gary nodded, but before they could continue with the cleaning, one of the guards ran in through the back door, yelling out, Brad, where are you? I'm right here. Keep your pants on, Brad responded. We have to get down to the community center now. First they steal my tools and now they want my help? Before the guard could respond, the sounds of gunfire popping off in the distance could be heard. They're being overrun. Chapter 3. Brad and Gary pumped their legs hard as they sprinted down the street, the two guards close behind. They reached the next intersection, getting a clear view of the carnage happening outside the community center. Small groups of prisoners and guards alike were taking positions on top of cars in the parking lot, stabbing their weapons down toward the ghouls that surrounded them. The group watched in horror as one of the creatures reached up, grasping a prisoner's ankle and pulling it toward its gaping maw. The prisoner let out a frantic yell as he fell off balance. His partner on top reached over for him, trying to prevent him from going over the side, but his momentum was too great. Unfortunately for the would-be helper, the doomed man allowed his panic to set in, keeping his grip tight on his friend's arm as he plunged into the crowd of ghouls below. The foursome watched helplessly as the two prisoners hit the pavement, only to be immediately surrounded by the ravenous creatures. We have to get to them, now, the guard shouted. No, we have to fortify our position over by the sign, Brad argued. You're not in charge here, prisoner, the guard snapped back. If you want to live, then I damn well better be. Now we're going to the sign, Brad insisted. The guard raised his rifle in a threatening manner but did not aim it directly at Brad, who just stood there staring at the guard, almost daring him to shoot. Go ahead, don't let me stop you. Squeeze that trigger, buddy. Let those things know exactly where you are, which is in the middle of the road with no cover. Now, how about instead of being a part of the problem, You actually listened to someone who has been on the front lines fighting against these things rather than sitting on my fat ass watching others do the heavy lifting, Brad challenged. There was a long, uncomfortable silence filled only with the moans of the ghouls in the distance. So what's it going to be? Brad asked. The agitated guard continued gripping his rifle tightly until his partner gently put his hand on it, getting him to lower it. Fine, we'll do it your way, the guard conceded. Let's get to the sign, Brad directed. Brad led the group toward the sign in the front corner of the parking lot, only 20 yards from where the two prisoners had fallen moments earlier. He shoved Gary toward the corner of the large metal sign. New rule, Gary, how to bullshit your way out of a poorly planned military operation. Now I want you to take a knee right at the corner there and have your spear planted firmly in the ground, aiming upwards at a 45-degree angle, Brad instructed. Gary nodded and did as instructed, while Brad moved to do the same thing. Once he was situated on the ground beside Gary, Brad barked out orders to the guards. When I tell you to, I want you to fire off a couple of shots toward that mob that's feasting on those poor bastards. And when I say a couple of shots, that's exactly what I mean. 2 shots. Pop. Pop. Understood? The two guards hesitated, looking at each other, hoping the other would confirm it for them. Finally, they both shrugged and nodded. You're calling it out, Brad, one of the guards said. Good, Brad responded. He turned his focus back to the ground where the creatures were still feasting on the prisoners. So what are you looking for? Gary asked. I don't know why those things stop eating, but it's almost like they can sense when the victim is gone, Brad explained. Gary began to speak again, but Brad put his finger up, getting him to stop talking. The seasoned prisoner stared intently through the mass of rotting flesh as they began to shamble away from the two prisoners on the ground. Get ready. 2 shots only, and do not fire again until I tell you to, Brad ordered. The two guards exchanged a concerned look but ultimately let out a soft okay. Brad continued to stare, finally seeing movement from the fallen men. Their arms twitched ever so slightly, followed by their legs coming back to life. Moments later, the two fallen prisoners pulled themselves up to their feet, looking around for a direction to run. Fire now, Brad commanded. The two guards did as instructed, squeezing off a round each toward the horde of ghouls. Both of their bullets were off the mark, slamming into the torsos of shamblers. However, the noise was enough to garner the attention of the 2 freshly minted zombies, who turned and began sprinting toward the group at the sign. We have to shoot them, one of the guards exclaimed. Not until I tell you to, Brad insisted. The 2 guards did as they were instructed, standing there, aiming their rifles toward the runners, who were getting closer and closer to them by the second. Take the first one that comes up. I don't care if he's in front of me. Aim that spear for its chest, Brad instructed Gary. You got it, Gary confirmed. Gary watched intently as the first zombie got within a few yards, adjusting the tip of his spear accordingly. A moment later, the creature slammed chest first into it with enough force that it nearly knocked it free from Gary's hands. Despite the near fumble, he managed to keep a grip on it, the ghoul thrashing violently as it continued pushing its way toward Gary, the metal working its way through the creature's body. A moment later, the second runner crashed into the tip of Gary's spear, following in his comrade's footsteps. As soon as Brad saw that the zombie was secure on the spike, he yelled out, "Shoot them in the head." Both guards squeezed off a shot each, the bullets finding their targets, ripping through the heads of the 2 creatures, who immediately tumbled to the ground. Gary began pulling on his weapon, trying to free it from the creatures, but he was interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps on the pavement. Brad darted out from behind cover, spotting another runner coming their way, this one in a tattered and bloody military uniform. As the ghoul got within striking distance, Brad darted forward, thrusting his shorter weapon toward the creature. The weapon went right through the ghoul's chest, but its momentum was significant, forcing Brad to lean back and pull on his spear with everything he could muster. The maneuver lifted the creature off the ground, sending it tumbling over Brad and landing headfirst on the pavement with a sickening thud. The guards winced as they heard the neck snap upon impact. As the zombie lay on the ground convulsing, Brad quickly yanked his weapon free, jamming the tip into the skull of the creature to finish it off. Once the creature was dispatched, Brad looked back to the others, who were standing there in stunned disbelief at the move he had just pulled off. "So what rule number was that?" Gary asked. "Survive the first week, and I'll teach you," Brad replied. "Fair enough," Gary responded. "You two, help Gary get his weapon free. We still have work to do," Brad commanded. Brad motioned toward the 20 or so zombies that were shambling in their direction, still 10 yards away but closing. The two guards went to work, holding the deceased prisoners so that Gary could pull his weapon free. As soon as it was, Brad walked by, motioning for the others to follow. "Where in the hell do you think you're going?" one of the guards questioned. "Just getting ourselves some fighting room," Brad answered. The guards looked back at the mob, which was within 5 yards. They quickly nodded to each other and ran back with the others, setting up in the middle of the road 20 yards away. "So now what do we do?" Gary asked. "Switch weapons with me," Brad instructed. Gary didn't argue the point, simply tossing over the 7-foot-long spear and taking the 5-foot one. Brad thrusted a couple of times with the new weapon, getting a feel for it before looking back to the guards. "We have to break this mob up. I want you each to concentrate your fire on the outer sections. I'm going to handle the middle," Brad directed. "Handle the outer sections. What in the hell does that mean?" one of the guards asked. "It means you shoot one of them in the face so that they fall and trip up the others. Just do enough to slow them down. I know ammunition is tight, so while you're doing that, I'm going to get us a shish kebab going," Brad explained. The two guards nodded and took aim at the mob that was getting closer and closer. Brad didn't speak, he just started walking toward the creature in the middle, prompting the two guards to open fire. Their initial shots both found their targets, blowing out the brains of 2 shamblers, causing a domino effect as they fell to the ground. While the outer edges of the mob slowed down, the center portion was still on pace. Brad took aim with the sharpened rebar, thrusting it forward into the chest of the lead creature, a slightly larger than normal man who met an untimely end with a bite to his neck. Rather than use the trapped creature to knock others to the ground, Brad strained to push the spear all the way through and into the creature that was coming up from behind it. "Hit them again," Brad commanded. The two guards opened fire, striking down 2 more ghouls as Brad continued to push his spear through another 2 creatures, putting 4 onto it before letting go and backing up quickly. "Gary, give me my spear," Brad ordered. Gary nodded as Brad turned around and darted forward, delivering a quick, clean shot to the head of the first creature, dropping it to the ground and pulling the other ensnared zombies to the ground with it. Brad looked out at the battlefield in front of him, seeing that the creatures were spread out, with more than half of them on the ground from tripping over their fallen comrades. He stepped up to the closest one, delivering a kill shot with his spear. "Keep a watch on the left side while I clear out the right. Don't shoot unless you absolutely have to, or if I tell you to. It doesn't look like we've pulled too many of those things away from the front of the building, and I'd like to keep it that way," Brad instructed. "We'll cover you, Brad," one of the guards replied. Brad nodded to the guard before turning his attention back towards the mob of ghouls, immediately focusing on one creature that was struggling to get back to its feet. Brad rushed forward, jumping up and landing on the creature's back with both boots, slamming it to the ground before jamming the tip of his spear into the back of its head. The guards and Gary watched in amazement as Brad systematically worked his way through the mob, dispatching them with ease with his makeshift weapon, kicking creatures to the ground before pointing at a trio of ghouls coming at him from the left flank. "One shot into the leader," Brad ordered. One of the guards obliged, taking aim and firing, the bullet ripping through the side of its skull. As the creature dropped to the ground, the other 2 tripped up as they continued to pursue Brad, making them easy prey for his spear. A couple of intense minutes later, and the mob was no more, laying in a heap on the pavement. The only creatures still moving were the trio that were trapped on the rebar. Brad walked over to them, standing just off to the side as he barked out more orders. "Okay, we're going to take these 3 out, then go save the day. And I don't know about you guys, but after that, I think it's lunchtime." Chapter 4. Brad stepped forward with his spear, thrusting it deep into the skull of the last standing zombie. The creature convulsed as it collapsed to the ground, and Brad stood over it like a proud hunter. He looked around at the battlefield in front of the community center. Dozens of corpses were strewn about the parking lot, prisoners and guards alike climbing down from the tops of cars, some visibly shaken from the ordeal they had just survived. Brad got lost deep in thought, wondering if this would have happened if the military had bothered to give the prisoners proper gear to deal with the threat. At the end of the day, it didn't really matter because he knew that to the powers that be, they were dead weight, unworthy of the scant resources available. Brad's contemplations were interrupted as one of the guards walked up to him. "Is that the last of them?" the guard asked. "As far as I can tell. If you have a couple of men who aren't shaking in fear, you might want to send them around to give those things another poke in the head," Brad replied. "I'll get them going with that right now," the guard said. "So where do you want Gary and I to go?" Brad asked. "The boss wants to see you. He's at the house on the corner over there," the guard informed him. Brad nodded as the guard walked away, watching as Gary came jogging over to him. "Are you good, Brad?" Gary asked. "I'm still standing, so I guess I'm doing as good as I can be." "What about you?" Brad responded. "I'm a little shook up, but I'll manage," Gary admitted. "Don't worry. The more you stab those things in the head, the easier it gets," Brad reassured him. "That's not what shook me up. It was the look on those men's faces. The pain and terror of watching their friends get eaten alive," Gary confessed. Brad stood there for a moment, as if he was having a flashback. It took him a moment to shake it off before continuing. "Yeah, some of those things you see can't easily be unseen, but they'll have to deal with it like the rest of us. Now come on. The boss wants to see us." Gary nodded as the two of them walked across the street toward the house on the corner. Out front stood a couple of armed soldiers who waved for the duo to go inside. "He's in the kitchen," one of the guards called out as they crossed the threshold into the house. Brad's senses sprang to life as the scent of fried meat hit his nostrils. "Hey boss, we're here," Brad announced. "Brad, come on into the kitchen." "Lunch is almost ready," the boss replied. Brad and Gary walked to the back of the house, spotting the boss standing over the gas stove, working 3 of the burners with various pots and pans. "Come on in and have a seat, Brad." "A deal's a deal, you got your newbie to lunch," the boss said. "I appreciate that, boss. What's on the menu today?" Brad inquired. "There wasn't much in the cupboards, but I have some pasta with grilled canned meat and sauce," the boss explained. "Sounds like the best meal I've had all week," Brad remarked. "Brad here has done a great job showing me the ropes," Gary added. "I assumed so since you're still alive," the boss said. Gary winced a bit, realizing that he was lucky to still be amongst the living. "So is the survival rate really that low on this detail?" he asked. "Did you think I was lying to you?" Brad responded. "I thought it might have been a scare tactic to get me to pay attention," Gary admitted. "This world is scary enough without having to take extra steps," Brad said. Gary thought about it for a moment before nodding in agreement. "So Gary, what did you do to find yourself stuck here?" the boss asked. "Do we really have to do this, boss?" Brad interjected. "What? I want to see if it's as good as yours," the boss replied. "What did you do to get here, Brad?" Gary asked. "This isn't about me," Brad stated. "Brad's right. I know his story. I want to know yours," the boss insisted. "Did they not tell you why I was here?" Gary asked. "The only information I get is how many newcomers are showing up and what areas need clearing. So talk, Gary, and I just might find an extra plate for you," the boss encouraged. Gary glanced over to Brad, confused that he might not get to eat. "A hot meal is the reward I get for keeping you alive. Your reward is that you get to continue being alive," Brad explained. Gary let out a sigh before opening up. "Well, in the early days of all this, my squad was dispatched to this little shithole of a town called Sedgwick, just north of Wichita. We were doing the usual stuff like taking care of the infected and setting up defenses in case Wichita started emptying out." As Gary spoke, Brad let out a scoff, shaking his head. "What's that for?" Gary asked. "You had one of the easiest details, as far away from the carnage of Kansas City, and you still ended up here," Just amazing, Brad commented. Now, Brad, let the man finish. We still don't know what he's done yet, the boss interjected. It's not as exciting as you think it's going to be, Gary admitted. I'll be the judge of that, the boss replied. Gary paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before letting out a long sigh. So after getting the town squared away, we had orders to relocate the survivors because there was a mob coming their way. After the town was evacuated, I was ordered to do a final sweep to make sure we didn't leave anyone behind. At one of the last houses, I found a fully stocked pantry filled with all kinds of wonderful things. Snack cakes, chips, you name it, they had it. So rather than let it go to waste, I grabbed a bag and filled up as much as I could carry. When I got back to the squad, one of the higher-ups from Central Command was there. He spotted my bag and laid into me about stealing supplies. He not only dressed me down in front of my squad, but had me arrested. You're right, that's not very exciting, Brad remarked. I told you, Gary responded. Wait, something's not adding up. If you were arrested a week and a half ago, why are you just now getting assigned to this group? The boss asked. I sat in a cell for a solid week, fully expecting to be released. I figured they wanted to make an example out of me to scare the other troops. Sadly, I was more right than I wanted to be, Gary explained. One of the higher-ups put me on a train up here, but not before parading me in front of the rest of the troops waiting to board. And he made damn sure they knew I had stolen food, Gary added. So you were a sacrificial lamb, huh? The boss remarked. Pretty much, Gary admitted. Sucks to be you. I can't imagine being given a death sentence for grabbing some snack cakes, Brad said. Yet here I am. Now, Brad, what did you do to end up here? Gary asked. It doesn't matter, I'm here, Brad replied. Don't be shy, Brad. Tell the man, the boss insisted. I'm good, boss, Brad said. Either you tell him or I will, the boss threatened. Do what you gotta do, boss. As long as I get my meal, that's all I care about, Brad responded. Well, big ol' Brad here shot his commanding officer in the back, the boss revealed. Gary looked over to Brad with a horrified look, yet Brad didn't react at all. He just continued to sit there, his attention focused on the stovetop. You murdered your CO? Gary asked. Two things. One, he wasn't my CO. And two, I didn't murder him, Brad clarified. So what do you call shooting the man in the back? The boss inquired. Saving lives, Brad replied. Oh, I'm going to need more than that, Gary demanded. That's all you're going to get, Brad stated. Tell the story, and I'll throw in a hot dinner too, the boss offered. Brad thought about it for a moment, letting out a long sigh before continuing. It was during the second day of the Kansas City shit show. I was part of a special forces squad that was sent into an unsecured suburb in an attempt to extract a high-value target. A high-value target? Gary asked. Someone with skills that aren't easily replaced in the apocalypse. I don't know what this guy was. Scientist, doctor, it didn't really matter. Our orders were to get him, Brad explained. Okay, I'm tracking now, Gary said. Anyway, things went south pretty quickly once we reached the building. The whole place was overrun with those things, and the only way we were getting in was if there was a diversion. I drew the short straw. So I worked my way a couple blocks south and set up the diversion. It worked like a charm, but the only problem was it left me stranded, Brad continued. It wasn't until the next day that another squad worked their way through the area, pulling enough of those things away so that I could escape, Brad added. Brad's train of thought was derailed as the boss clattered together some dishes, signaling that lunch was nearly ready. I managed to make my way over to them, even helped them secure the small apartment building they were ordered to take and hold. It was a brutal fight, but we managed to clear out the common areas, Brad said, stopping again, wincing as memories flooded his mind. It took him a moment to gather himself before speaking again. Their mission objective had been secured. We had control of the building. But their sergeant decided he wanted to go above and beyond and fully clear the building out, which included the community room. Let me guess. The community room still had a significant number of community members in it? Gary asked. You could see through the windows that it was packed with those things, but that didn't matter to that asshole. He wanted the building clear, no matter the risk. So I spoke my mind in a forceful manner, and he responded in kind. The next thing I know, I have a gun 6 inches from my face. I tuned out everything he said after that because I knew there was no reasoning with him. I'm not sure what his problem was, but apparently he didn't like anybody questioning his authority, Brad explained. That happened a lot in the early days, the boss commented. The virus laid waste to our command structure, so a lot of guys got promoted simply because they were a warm body. There wasn't time to do a proper vetting. I have no doubt this guy was one of those. Anyway, I saw a couple of his men speak up, trying to reason with him, which only enraged him further. As soon as he turned the gun towards the other men, I shoved him forward. After that, my instincts kicked in, quick drawing my sidearm and firing. One shot, straight through the back, dropped him. His men tried to save him, but it didn't happen, Brad continued. And they arrested you for that? Gary asked. His men tried to explain the situation, but they had a zero-tolerance policy, and an example had to be made, Brad replied. There's a lot of that going around, Gary remarked. The conversation was interrupted as the boss put 2 bowls of piping hot pasta down in front of the 2 prisoners. Both men inhaled deeply, savoring every cent. Sounds like you boys got a raw deal, assuming of course it went down like you said it did. Now eat up, there's still a lot of work left to be done before we lose the light, the boss said. Brad and Gary nodded in appreciation to the boss as he fixed his own dish. The 3 of them fell silent as they dove into their hot meal. Chapter 5. Brad ran down the hallway, his spear at the ready as he yelled out to Gary, "Duck down and keep them in place." Brad instructed. Gary did as instructed, dropping down to one knee while keeping his hands firmly on the spear, which had 2 zombies impaled on the other end. The creatures thrashed about, their hands smacking against the doorframe of the bedroom. In a flash, Brad was on them, lunging forward with his spear and piercing the skull of the lead creature. As soon as he yanked the weapon free, the ghoul slumped forward, revealing the face of its partner directly behind him. Brad steadied himself before delivering another forceful blow, the tip of the spear going through the eye socket of the zombie, ending its threat. Both men stood there for a moment, catching their breath and enjoying the silence. "That was some solid work, Gary," Brad remarked. "Thanks, Brad. Just using what you told me," Gary replied. "It takes those slow ones a minute to get themselves wedged onto the spear, but they'll get there," Brad noted. "How's the garage looking?" Gary asked. One of them was trapped in their car. "I put it down, then helped myself to his tools," Brad said, holding up a shiny new hammer, barely a scratch on it before sliding it through his belt. "So, we're clear here?" Gary inquired. "Looks that way." "Come on, there's still a couple more houses on this block we need to wrap up," Brad stated. "It never ends, does it?" Gary sighed. "As long as the sun is up, we're clearing," Brad affirmed. "Oh good, so only a few more hours then," Gary muttered. The 2 men walked out of the house, stopping on the front porch and looking across the street towards a commotion. One of the prisoners was sitting on the ground, yelling something incomprehensible as he held onto his arm. His partner stood over him, putting his hands out and trying to say something, but it was falling on deaf ears. "What's going on?" Gary asked. "My guess is one of those guys screwed up, and the other paid for it," Brad speculated. "Paid for it?" Gary questioned. Before Brad could answer, one of the guards stepped up and put a round into the side of the bitten man's head. As he slumped to the ground, his partner fell to his knees, devastated. "Jesus Christ, they just execute you if you get bitten," Gary exclaimed. "It wasn't always like that. Early on, they gave the man a choice because sometimes a man just wants some good old-fashioned revenge before scuttling off this mortal coil. While it worked well for a couple of days, that all changed when one of the prisoners decided he wanted revenge on one of the guards who had been giving him a hard time. It happened in a flash. The prisoner turned and planted his zombie blood-soaked spear into the gut of the guard," Brad explained. "Did the guard live?" Gary asked. "I don't know. Nobody does," Brad admitted. "There were rumors going around that he was taken to quarantine to see if he would turn or not. I don't know if that's true. All I know is I haven't seen him since. Well, that's all kinds of horrifying. Nothing like knowing you're going to die only to spend your last hours as a test subject, Gary shuddered. All the more reason to follow my rules, Brad warned. Speaking of, which house are we hitting next? Gary inquired. Might as well go straight down the line, Brad suggested. The two-story one. Okay, let's do it, Gary agreed. The two prisoners walked across the yard towards the front door, relieved to see that the curtains were wide open in the front room. Should we do a sweep around the perimeter? Gary asked. You tell me. This is the 10th house we've cleared today, so I'm following your lead, Brad replied. Gary took a moment to let the courage build before nodding and taking charge. The curtains are open on most of the windows, so I think this one is going to be clear. We'll look in through the front window, and if we don't see any movement, we'll go in. Lead the way, Brad encouraged. Gary walked over to the front window, looking into the living room and not seeing much. There wasn't any blood, no signs of commotion, just a normal living room that hadn't been touched in weeks. Would you mind breaking out the window on the door? The shorter spear is a little easier to manage, Gary requested. You got it, Brad agreed. Brad stepped up, making a simple thrust with his weapon, shattering the small glass panel on the door. He stepped back to allow Gary to unlock the door. Just before he reached inside, Brad grabbed his arm. Always look through to make sure the coast is clear, he reminded. Gary nodded, knowing that Brad was right. He did as instructed, peeking through the opening and not seeing anything. After unlocking the deadbolt and walking inside, they listened intently for sound but ultimately heard nothing. If you want to clear the garage, I'll take the back bedrooms, Gary offered. Are you sure, Gary? Brad asked. Am I in charge? Gary retorted. Brad let out a deep sigh before nodding slightly. Okay, just be careful. And remember the rules, he advised. Don't worry, I will. Meet back here in 2 minutes. And if there's a good-looking hammer out there, grab one for me, Gary said with a grin. Brad didn't speak. Rather, he just turned and headed towards the garage. He knew that it was risky letting Gary do what he wanted to, but he hoped that Gary had taken everything he had taught him to heart. Gary watched as Brad found the garage door before turning to focus on his task, the bedrooms on the other side of the house. Rather than tread carefully, Gary walked confidently across the floor, his footfalls echoing throughout the house. As he approached the back hallway, he stopped when he heard noise coming from above. Now, what do we have here? Gary murmured. Gary went back to the stairs, standing at the base of them and listening intently. He could hear the shuffling of feet and some light banging upstairs, clearly more than one creature up there, but he couldn't put his finger on just how many. Well, let's get their attention, Gary decided. He smacked his spear against the wall, sending a metallic clang echoing up the stairs. A few seconds later, a creature emerged at the top of the stairs. There you are. Why don't you come down and say hello? Gary taunted. Gary watched as the creature took a step down, quickly losing its balance and falling face first on the stairs. Before he could put it down with a strike, however, 2 more creatures shambled towards the top of the stairs. Gary watched as the one at the rear spotted him first, shoving its comrade forward as they both tumbled over the threshold. Rather than step back for safety, Gary froze, watching as the creatures doubled up on the stairs and began sliding down. Holy shit, Gary exclaimed. By the time Gary realized what was happening, it was too late. He froze for a second too long, allowing the creatures to slide down the stairs. When the bottom zombie hit the first one that fell, the one riding its back continued sliding forward. Gary darted back, but the ghoul managed to reach out and smack into his legs, sending Gary tumbling to the ground. Brad. Gary yelled out as he thrashed about, kicking his legs in a frantic attempt to break free of the creature. Despite his best efforts, he was unable to break free, and the creature sunk its rotting teeth into his calf. Gary let out a pained scream as Brad came rushing in, immediately driving his spear through the head of the attacking ghoul. I'm bit. I'm bit, Gary screamed. Brad didn't respond to Gary's screams, instead moving to the stairs and quickly delivering forceful strikes to the other 2 creatures before they could get back to their feet. As the room fell silent, Gary lay on the ground, weeping and muttering prayers under his breath. After several moments, Brad looked down, seeing the unmistakable sign of a bite. Rather than scold the doomed man, he just shook his head. "I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry," Gary sobbed. "You don't have to apologize to me," Brad said softly. Gary let out another frustrated, pained scream as he pulled himself up, sliding across the floor so that his back was against the wall. He glanced down at his wound, quickly looking away. Brad didn't speak a word as he stepped in front of him, raising his spear up and aiming it straight at Gary's head. "Just do it, man," Gary pleaded. Brad prepared to strike, but held off for several moments before lowering the weapon ever so slightly. "Were you telling the truth about why you ended up on this detail?" Brad asked. "What?" "Yeah, it was 100% truth," Gary confirmed. Brad stared at him for a moment before breaking away and walking into the kitchen. Gary sat there, confused as he heard cabinets being thrown open. A few moments later, Brad came back and carrying a box of snack cakes, tossing them down to Gary. "It's bullshit what they did to you. So I figure you're entitled to a last meal of sorts," Brad said. Gary let out a chuckle as he tore into the box, grabbing a couple of them out and offering one to Brad. "Do you want one?" Gary asked. "Might as well. It's not like they can put me on a worse detail," Brad replied. Gary tossed the tasty treat up to Brad as he took a seat on the stairs. Both men sat in silence as they devoured the entire box of treats. Neither man spoke a word because they both knew what was going to happen once they were finished. As Gary popped the final bite of the treat into his mouth, he sat there satisfied with a full belly. Brad looked at him with a sense of pity, knowing that the condemned man sitting before him didn't deserve this fate. Despite the pity, he knew what needed to be done. Brad stood up, gripping his spear tightly as he positioned himself directly in front of Gary. "Are you ready, Gary?" he asked. Gary sat there for a moment, resigned to his fate. Is anybody ever really rie? Before Gary could finish his sentence, Brad thrusted his spear forward. The tip pierced through Gary's skull, flicking his light switch and sending him into darkness in a fraction of a second. Brad yanked his weapon free before walking straight to the front door of the house. As he emerged, he made a beeline to the street, letting out a whistle to get the attention of one of the guards who rushed over. "What is it, Brad?" the guard asked. "The newbie screwed up," Brad stated. "Has he been neutralized?" the guard inquired. "He has," Brad confirmed. "Are you good?" the guard asked. "I haven't been good for a while, so why start now?" Brad replied. "There's a swing on the porch of the house we just cleared. Why don't you head over there and take 5, the guard suggested. Brad was unemotional as he walked across the street, tossing his weapon to the ground on his way up onto the porch. He took a seat on the swing, rocking back and forth gently as he watched the other prisoners in the area dragging dead bodies out into the street. Internally, he wanted to scream in frustration, wondering how many good men were being condemned to die for minor offenses. Externally, he remained stone-faced, rocking back and forth gently as the cool breeze washed over him, enjoying a brief moment of solitude before it was time to rejoin the clearing. The end.